Hello and good evening and welcome to episode 92 of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks very much to everyone who's joining us live tonight. We're on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, so thank you for joining us. First thing I'd like to do is welcome on to stage my co-host Karen Van Sweden. Hello Karen, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. And now I'd like to introduce our guest for the evening, Jamie Cook. Hello Jamie, how's it going?
Good evening. It's good, thank you.
Brilliant. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to have Jamie on the show tonight talking about a basic income, because I look back at our messages and Jamie and I started speaking over a year ago to try and get him onto the show. So we've had a big run up at this and I'm absolutely delighted to have you on, Jamie. The first question I'd like to ask you before we get into all the details around a basic income is, I suppose, just really what made you become interested in this as a topic? And I would certainly describe you as an advocate and a campaigner for basic income. So if you could give us a little bit of the background about where your kind of passion for the idea of a basic income came from, and then we'll get into all the details about what a basic income actually is.
Yeah, thanks. And it's funny because when I first came into contact with the idea, I certainly wasn't an advocate or a campaigner for it. So a basic income is sometimes known as universal basic income and unconditional basic income. It's one of those terms that has a lot of names attached to it. For me, I came into contact in about 2016. So a colleague of mine at the organisation I've been working at, Anthony Painter, had written a report for us looking at this idea of a basic income, kind of placing it within a civil society. How do you kind of rebuild the bonds of society through giving people income security? He'd written that in 2015. I'd kind of only just started to read it in 2016. And at the time, running an organisation called RSA Scotland, we had an annual lecture. And so I was looking for a theme for that year's lecture and decided we'd look at basic income. And to be honest, it was because I saw it as a really interesting provocation rather than something I actually thought was realistic or would actually be deliverable. From the little I knew of it, it seemed a good way for us to stop and look at the current social security system that we had in place to really identify where many of the failings were. And then maybe give that chance of looking at something radical and different that would push us through there. And so I invited Professor Guy Standing, who's a world-leading expert in basic income, to come to Edinburgh and deliver that lecture. And we also organised a round table just after it with local authorities, Scottish Government, representatives from civic society to have that discussion. And what really struck me quite quickly was that sense that the provocations were, of course, there. We could see those failings, we could see the impact it was having on people's lives. But actually, there was a real interest and positive response to this idea of a basic income, that this idea you could actually provide that regular security of an income, but also one, as I'm sure we'll explore in a bit more detail later, that has these kind of radical ideas of being unconditional and actually trusting people to make decisions. I also quite like the fact it seemed to also annoy people from every part of the political spectrum. Whenever I do talks in Scotland, I'm quite happy if by the end somebody's called me a communist and someone else has called me a libertarian, because it usually implies you're getting somewhere nicely in the middle. But what really struck me was then the speed with which that momentum grew. So that was, kind of April 2016. By later 2016, Guy was back over in Glasgow for another event. We'd actually had Glasgow City Council kind of sign up to the idea of piloting the concept within the city, following on from Fife, who'd actually been the kind of trailblazers within Scotland. So it really felt there was that sense of momentum and of interest. And for me, the more that I looked at perhaps what a basic income or something along those lines could offer, what it could change and how we could build on top of that, it seemed more and more to me, not the answer, but part of what we needed to create if we were going to create a better and fairer economy and social security system moving forward.
Fantastic. So I think just to qualify that then, when we're talking about a basic income, are we talking about an unconditional basic income or a universal basic income, or is there some kind of difference in the overall kind of term basic income?
No, so a basic income as defined by Basic Income Earth Network, BN, who are the kind of global organization supporting basic income, is a regular, unconditional, secure payment that's paid individually to all members of society. So it's those core components. it's regular, you know it's going to be there. It's paid to individuals, not to families, not to head of household, but to each individual within society. As I say, it's universal, so therefore everybody gets it regardless of income and other resources. And then that unconditional, you do not have anything attached to it. You do not have to be looking for work. You do not be having to spend it in a certain way or not spend it in a certain way. It's fully up to you what you do with it. So that unconditionality, that universality, and that security are those core components that certainly most people in terms of a basic income would see as the essential criteria for it.
Brilliant. So thanks for clarifying that. My next question is, again, just a little bit more background, is what's the kind of history of the basic income? You talk about guys standing there being involved, but is this idea of a basic income something that's fairly recent, or does it have a history going back decades or maybe even longer than that?
Yeah, no, it's an old idea, and it's been explored in variations and different takes upon it. And it's part of the difficulty of the concept, that you get variations of how you can play with it. But this goes back to, Thomas More looked at it as an idea. Thomas Paine during the American Revolution proposed it as a variation, as an idea that could bring fairness into society. It was also something then that was explored. It's kind of fluctuated through history, I suppose. So it has moments where it seems right in the cusp of delivery, and then it seems to disappear again. The 70s was actually quite a big, kind of 60s and 70s was a big period for interest in basic income, particularly in North America. We had some quite significant experiments take place there. You had people like Martin Luther King was a very significant proponent for basic income. It was a key part that he was starting to look at, sadly, just before his assassination. But also actually, one of America's most progressive presidents in history, Richard Nixon, very nearly introduced a variation of a basic income to the United States that was actually opposed by the Democrats at the time. So again, it seemed at that point it was right on the kind of verge of being brought in. And then I think ran into the kind of political and economic changes of the late 70s and into the 80s, where it very much was pushed to the margins again. So it's had that history, but I suppose had very much, certainly when we were talking about this in 2016, although there'd been some fantastic folk in Scotland working on this for some time, it had very much slipped to the kind of the margins of society. But then over the last few years, we've seen that come back for a variety of reasons that I'm sure we can explore in more detail.
Okay, fantastic.
So I guess I want to know really the gubbins. So how is it going to work? In the first instance, I want to understand if you have been campaigning to the currency issuer, which is Westminster, or the Scottish Government to do this. And then looking at, for example, having a basic income as opposed to having or taking over from Social Security. How would it work in different parts of the country? For example, somewhere like Aberdeen, which has very high fluctuating house prices, Edinburgh also high house prices, to somewhere like Arbroath, or somewhere more rural. How do you see that working in that sense?
Yeah, so I think taking that last point as a starter, I think that's one of the big challenges that basic income as a overarching policy has faced, which is the housing market. I think, with most versions of basic income proposed, you obviously roll a lot of the existing social security system into that. Housing policy and housing support, with the way the market, you touched on it perfectly there within a Scottish context. When you roll that out to a UK-wide context and look at London and South East, it becomes impossible. And I'd be very keen for anyone who's watching tonight, or for either of you, if you've got a solution to the housing aspect, I'd love to see how we could build that in. I think, though, there is an important aspect to that, which is certainly for me, and I would say for virtually anyone I've worked with or spoken to on this issue, basic income is not some sort of silver bullet. It's not some sort of catch-all, solve every problem we face. The way I see it is it's a foundational policy that you build on top of, and therefore that also requires other policies to work. So we've touched on there, housing is an issue in terms of housing support. It's also a huge issue around rent. I think it would be impossible to introduce a basic income without looking at rent control, because otherwise you could imagine that private landlords would just instantly put their rent up by whatever the basic income was. I remember giving a talk before in Edinburgh where somebody stood up and said, "This is fantastic. We could introduce a basic income and scrap, the minimum wage tomorrow." Well, actually, if we did that, then employers would cut wages by the income. So it's very much needs that connection into other areas there. And I think that housing aspect, what I would see is you would still probably housing. There's two aspects, I think, of the system that would need to be retained. So one is housing as it stands, because I don't see how we can currently reconcile that with the way the market sits. The other one I think it's important to point out, because I've certainly made the mistake of not being clear on this before, is that disability support is an individual support. It's not a societal-wide one. And I think that's important because we've sometimes made the mistake of seeming as if that would magically be covered by a basic income, when of course the individual requirements of people with disability support is separate to that. In terms of that, where are we looking to influence this? Well, I mean, it's probably not going to be any surprise to anyone that the UK government has not necessarily been a huge supporter of this. They've dismissed it out of hand. It's been looked at very briefly from a UK level. Interestingly, at the beginning of COVID, which is one of the more recent kind of turning points around interest in the basic income, there was call from some Conservative MPs in England to actually introduce an emergency basic income. But overall, the UK government has not been open to it as a concept. That doesn't mean we haven't tried to have those conversations and influence, but I think it's been a difficult challenge. We've seen a lot more interest and support from the devolved administrations and from authorities, particularly cities across the north of England, and also a few others, Brighton and a few others that have explored this. Scottish Government, last Scottish parliamentary elections, when the leadership debate took place just before the elections, 4 out of the 5 party leaders in Scotland expressed support for a basic income. Now, it was a leadership debate, so we're never sure how long those supports last afterwards. But it did show that there'd been a shift there and an interest from a Scottish level. More recently, the Welsh Government, who have been very supportive of basic income, Mark Drakeford, the current First Minister in Wales, is a long-term supporter of basic income. They've actually introduced a really interesting trial around young people leaving the care system. So there has been interest in a devolved level. The issue, of course, that we face, as with many policies, is that it can't be delivered under the current devolution settlement. We don't have the levers and the resources to be fully able to introduce a basic income at this point, certainly at a universal level. And so I suppose that, as with all of these, has run the risk of there has been policy development, there has been support, there's obviously been a lot of work carried out in Scotland and elsewhere, and Scotland's been seen as one of the leading nations in the world for the debate around basic income. But because we can't deliver it now, there's also been an element of it slightly running that risk of being put to one side. I think the difference that I saw over the years of talking to senior figures from Scottish Government, from the political parties, is that perhaps there was kind of an original sense of, we like this idea and one day we'll look at it, whether that be in an independent Scotland or whether that be in a different devolution settlement, was that recognition that actually if you don't do the work now, then you're never going to be prepared for that. You're not going to suddenly introduce a new system overnight if you're going through a period of constitutional change. So I think it's been positive that basic income and other areas, there's been that policy debate, discussion and experimentation. But yeah, I think in terms of how we push that next step of it, that's where we've seen that political challenge that so many issues run into within the devolution settlement just now.
Fantastic. I've got a comment here, Kieran, just from our audience before you carry on there. So Graham says a UBI could be introduced under Section 28 of the Scotland Act without UK government consent, provided, and this is important, Graham, wouldn't you agree? Provided that the revenue to fund it is raised in Scotland. And I would kind of say that's almost like saying, here's enough rope to kind of hang yourself. Because this element of funding is absolutely crucial when we're talking about anything that's larger than a small area within the country. So Graham, thanks so much for that. I'd be interested to see if you agree, if maybe are you suggesting that we should do that, or are you just highlighting that we could do it if we could raise the revenue? Please let us know in the comments there. Okay, Kieran?
Yeah, I mean, getting back to that point, first and foremost, we understand very well that governments spend first, or monetarily sovereign governments spend first and tax second, which is why they must usually have a deficit. Otherwise, there would be no money in the economy. So that's perfectly normal. And that's the situation that we as independent supporters want to see Scotland to become a currency issuer. So the other aspect to that as well, of running a currency and a taxation system as well, is that it is there to also furnish the country and ensure that goods and services are there to make the country work on a fundamental level. So coming to that aspect, For example, if you brought in a universal basic income as a monetarily sovereign Scotland, and what would happen to the health service? So all of a sudden, all the health workers suddenly get a day's wages and they think, right, I'm going to take that day off. And that happens en masse. What would you do about that? How would you cope with that?
I think it's an interesting.
Not you personally, Jamie. Not you personally, Jamie.
No. It's one of the critiques that's brought up is that somehow if we provide a basic income, people will stop working. The evidence from where experiments of basic income have been trialled around the world is that doesn't happen. Working levels tend to stay up there. And actually, as we look at other policies like 4-day working weeks and others that are being explored as well, we see that move towards giving people flexibility about how they work and how they choose to use that, impacting in different ways. I think for the NHS, I would be very surprised if we saw sudden mass stoppages of work over having an extra bit per week. But also I think there's something around the impact the longer term of basic income would also have on spending on health within the UK, where it's been tested in Scotland, where we've tested that in other places. The very famous experiment in Manitoba in Canada during the 70s, one of the big outcomes was to see a significant drop in actual use of emergency services, particularly for some issues around self-harm, suicide and other areas around this. So I think there would also be longer term investment benefits to Scottish public services if we actually could improve people's health and well-being through the securities there. But I think the evidence that we've seen recently is that, we had a pandemic where people were forced to stay at home and not work, and actually most people wanted to get back to it. So I'm pretty confident that the evidence and what we've seen in place would suggest that we would actually get better quality and better quality work and commitment to that from people within it. And actually, if it allowed us to look at how we support people within that service, this again, we talked about policies supporting each other. How do we actually bring more people to Scotland to supplement that workforce within the NHS as well? Perhaps having that flexibility within it would be a benefit within it.
Can you tell us more about the Manitoba experiment?
Yeah, so there's variations, as I say, upon basic income. And so this was more of what they call a minimum income guarantee, which has been looked at in Scotland just now. So rather than being universal, that's the sense that you top people up to make sure that they're never below a certain income. And so it has, you can get into the arguments about where universality is a benefit, where it supports policy or where actually targeting is better from there. But it was a experiment that was run looking at a minimum income guarantee within a few towns. So Dauphin in Manitoba in Canada was the main space. It was run for those communities for a period of a few years where they were given this top up to their money. It was then stopped just as it was really getting into full flow because there was a change of political administration. And really interestingly and quite depressingly was never actually analysed at the time. So the data that had been collected was put in boxes and put in a storeroom until luckily Professor Evelyn Forget in Canada found the data and went through it because there was no money in the original research for them to actually analyse what was taken from it. And she's done some fantastic work, and I highly recommend anyone who wants to know more looks up the work of Evelyn. She's been over to Scotland a few times, and it's been really fascinating. What came out in that was very much that sense of where did you start to see the impacts? So as I said, there was an impact over that time of hospital admissions and use of emergency, the A&E, because there was this drop in terms of certain impacts and behaviours in people in terms of self-harm, suicide and other uses of A&E. One of the big impacts it had was around the labour market. So we talked about, does this have an impact? There were two groups that were identified as having dropped their participation in the labour market during this experiment. One of them was new mums, because at that point in Canada, they didn't have any sort of maternity leave in place. And so the access to this income allowed new mums perhaps choose to stay off a bit longer, which generally was held up as a positive outcome. Interestingly, the one that was used against the experiment to partly ensure it wasn't continued was that there was a demonstrated impact of a drop of unattached young men participating in the workforce. And of course, any policy that seems to have fewer young men working seems to be a bad idea. But when it was analysed afterwards, they found that actually these were young men who were actually still school age and had been dropping out early because their families needed the economic input of them taking up a work, mostly in that space around manual labour and the farms and elsewhere. So it did have this beginning of a positive trend that had been seen in the US and elsewhere, but then, as I say, stopped at the end of the 70s, and it took us that long period until we were able to analyse it in a bit more detail and see some of those impacts, which we've seen across other experiments. Improved health and well-being, generally neutral or positive impacts on the labour market, and then that beginning of, does it open up new economic opportunities for those who perhaps stay on at school or have opportunities to continue in education.
Brilliant. That's great to hear that. That's why pilots are really important. But you've just raised an issue there, is that quite often you do a pilot and then nothing's done with the information. And after I've read a couple of these questions, so I'd like to come back to any of the trials in Scotland or the pilots in Scotland. I know one of our speakers at the Festival of Economics last year said that Scotland has more pilots than the RAF. So it'd be interesting to see what's happened. A couple of comments and questions there. Very supportive of Jamie's work in Wales. So that's from Mark Hooper. I wonder what his views on the Welsh basic income pilot for care leavers. And I before you answer that, Jamie, I assume that when you're doing these pilots, you can target particular people for basic income. It doesn't have to be a geographical area. It can be age, people who have left, the oil industry, for example. You can do it at that quite kind of granular level, can't you? So please come back to that one. A comment from our new TikTok stream. Basic income is pointless without adequate legislation in place around rent controls. Jamie actually started the presentation saying that. I think we're all in agreement with that. And a question, how would children be taken into consideration? I know we've mentioned kind of income related to the location and the housing, so there's an element into that as well. So those kind of two questions, a Welsh pilot and children, and then it'd be good to talk about any of the Scottish pilots as well.
Fantastic, yeah, and great to see Mark there. Mark's been a leading figure and driver for the basic income work in Wales, as well as many other areas of policy. So, yeah, fantastic to get a question from Mark. The Welsh pilot, I think, is a really fascinating one for several reasons, and you touched on it there, William, that there's a big debate around pilots within the basic income community that I would imagine is mirrored in many other policy communities as well. There are those who are very much in favour of them. We need as many as possible to make the evidence overwhelming and kind of, bring politicians and the public on board with us. And then there's those, myself included, who, particularly the large-scale pilots, are ever more sceptical about what they actually offer us in terms of taking the debate forward at this stage. So there's also then that leads to, do you have to only run something as close to basic income as possible, because you can't pilot a basic income. It's incredibly frustrating, but at the end of the day, you know what's going to finish at the end of the pilot. So in terms of those longer term impacts on your choices, how will that come into place? But also there's that sense of targeting. So the Welsh basic income pilot, as I say, is very much targeted at young people leaving the care system. I know that it's been announced that that's going to finish as scheduled rather than be extended because of the costs attached to it. But I think already the initial indications are that there's some really positive trends coming out of that, although obviously it's not had its full analysis yet. I think for me, there's a couple of really good things about the Welsh experiment, and I'd love to hear from Mark and others who are actually on the ground down there whether they agree with these. But for me, the first one is that the Welsh government has literally put its money where its mouth is. So when they announced that they wanted to try this out, the UK government said, well, we're going to tax whatever money you give to the young people who participate. And so the Welsh government, realising that this could actually undermine what then those young people are going to receive, has put its own additional budget to top that up. So I think the young people are receiving £1,600 a month, and I think there's been about 600 participants in that. So that was a sense of a devolved administration, not just saying, oh, well, UK government's being a bit mean about this, but actually, whilst it may not be sustainable in the long term, choosing to put some money together to try and push this forward. And I think that's something really positive to see. I think as well, the fact of looking at, an example like young people leaving the care system. So for example, this has been looked at in California as well. Actually, Santa Clara in California tested this with their young people leaving the care system. and actually introduced it as a permanent policy because they saw it as a better use of the resources. It's something that we've proposed with groups like Aberlour and staff here in Scotland to the Scottish government to say, look, you could run this. It contributes to the promise. It takes a lot of money that's already there, but gives that opportunity to young people. So for me, it gives us a space where we say, of course, doing this for young people leaving the care system does not show what it does for every aspect of society, but does it allow us to capture some of that impact within it? And therefore, I think it's fantastic that the Welsh government has taken that forward. I'm really keen to see what comes out in terms of the evidence from there. And that's where, although, as I say, and we can come back to, I have scepticism about too many pilots and experiments. I think there is a role for actually seeing both around the kind of impact on those individuals, but also going back to what you're saying, Karen, around implementation and the systems. It allows you to test it on a controlled level, which I think can be very useful. In terms of the question around children, so this can again vary between different policy suggestions. In general, so certainly the system we proposed when we wrote a report on this a few years ago, everyone over the age of 16 receives their own individual basic income paid directly to them. For those under the age of 16, the payment would be made on their behalf to primary caregiver, the presumption being in most cases the mum in that sense. So usually then the debate is over what level of payment. So some proposals will have a higher payment for adults and a lower payment for children. Others maybe bump the payment for children up as well. But generally, it would be seen that children would receive a lower level, but it would still be, they would receive a basic income as well, albeit paid to their caregiver in that sense.
Okay. Fantastic. We'll just give you 30 seconds because that was a lot of information you were pulling up from previous experience there. And thanks everyone for your comments. I'll make sure that I ask Jamie these comments and these questions, and also put the comments to the rest of the audience. Jamie, thinking about the Scottish pilots, what have we learned from those? I've got a comment from Evelyn here, who says that during the pandemic, Scottish government arranged basic income for those that could not get sick pay in order to isolate, and it was noted agency workforce were spreading virus and could not isolate financially. Not a pilot, but looks like some element of a basic income during COVID. So, experience in Scotland, what have we done and what have we learned from that?
Well, this is the irony, is we haven't actually piloted a basic income in Scotland. What we got to was a decision. So the Scottish Government introduced a feasibility study group, which comprised 4 local authorities who were most interested, or at least had been at the front line of interest. So Glasgow, Edinburgh, North Ayrshire and Fife, who, as I say, Fife have been looking at basic income for some time now, since the Fairer Fife Commission proposed it as a pilot opportunity. That was a large-scale piece of feasibility work over several years that proposed a, frankly, huge experiment for Scotland. Had that proceeded, it would have been 17,000 people participating in receiving a basic income, with another 17,000 in a control group. This would have been, one of, if not the biggest basic income experiments in the world. The proposal around that was that it would be, so we touched earlier on, do you focus on demographics? Do you focus on, parts of society? The proposal was to ideally try and, well, there could be different aspects to it, really look at that geographic spread. So if you could choose a small town, what happens when you give everybody in that town access to that money? Do you start to see changes around, use of local businesses, services, and so on? Obviously, that raises a huge number of complexities. Even the example, so I mentioned Guy Standing. Guy ran an experiment in India a few years ago where there was basic income given, I think it was to 7 villages in the north of India. And then there were 7 villages in the south who were held as a control group. And even in that, in a country the size of India, someone from one of the southern villages actually met someone from the northern villages and married him. And so you had that crossover between the two, which made the experiment difficult. The issue with the experiments that were proposed for Scotland, so the feasibility work that was carried out in Scotland was really, really important. It went into some of the complexities, the levers, the challenges that exist around trying to introduce a basic income at all. It had analysis from Fraser Valander suggesting some of those challenges. For me, they very much looked at it within the existing settlements, and therefore, it would be significant cuts to public spending if you're going to give people money. I think you need to try and look at, the kind of wider context you would hope that Scotland could be operating in as well. But I think there were two things. One, the feasibility study ran into the pandemic. So it reported after we'd hit lockdown and pandemic had hit, and the discussion had shifted quite rapidly in that sense, certainly in terms of experimentation, and also the sheer size. An experiment of that size, I don't think we'd be able to deliver in Scotland without buy-in from the UK government in terms of how that interacted with the existing social security system.
It seems strange that the suggestion was such a large initial kind of pilot. If it looks like that would be too big for us to do, even if we had all of the favourable wins. Someone looking at that from what you've said.
No, I agree, and I think it goes back to this discussion and debate about, do you need something huge that therefore proves the concept, or can you make progress with the smaller pieces joined together? And I think it was that sense of, if you were really going to try and shift the needle in this debate, it was going to require that massive amount of data and interaction. And, we've seen other ideas suggested elsewhere. So, in your neck of the woods, there's been a lot of discussion in Catalonia around, how things could be introduced. There was, looking at variations before. There's, I think, about 100 experiments taking place in various shapes and form across the US just now. So there's been a lot more maybe of the smaller ones picked up now. But I think there was that sense, after the Finnish experiments, which had about 2,000 participants, was this that idea that you needed to prove where it would go. But obviously what it did do was it gave us a lot of the challenges, to be honest. It really highlighted some of the mechanics of how you would try to deliver, particularly a place-based feasibility study, and a pilot. And I think that's been really beneficial to discussions across a number of different areas of the world. But it didn't then move forward into that next sense. And I think with where we are now in terms of the debate, particularly given the fact we can't implement policy under the current situation, that sense of a large-scale experiment, I think, is very much been put to one side. But it comes back to what we were saying about, our colleagues in Wales. Is there the chance to do some more that impacts around, smaller targeted groups that doesn't pretend this is showing the sheer universality of this, but actually allows us to see some of what comes out of it? And for me, I think the critical things to come out of any pilot trial opportunity, one is around, I think, that delivery. So actually, even with small groups, you can start to see, how do you get it to people? What do you need to have in place? I think the second one's the interaction with other policy areas. Checking that it doesn't lead to that change on, losing our NHS workforce, but also recognizing that a short-term pilot, people are not necessarily going to make a decision about cutting work. And so how are we aware of that? How do we build in those balances within it? And I think for me as well, something around the stories of the impact it can have in people's lives. I think there's lots of data from around the world. I think the pandemic, whilst it wasn't all basic incomes, I think it was Tuvalu was the only the Pacific Island nation introduced a basic income for all its citizens. It was the only one that formally introduced a basic income at that time, but we had a lot of direct cash payments. The United States gave out huge amounts of money directly to people to use. So we've got a lot of data, we've got a lot of facts and figures. I think there's something around the human story of that also is really important to explore. So that's where I think smaller scale experiments can have a role to play.
Fantastic. And that is... I'm really disappointed, because I thought we had trialled basic income in Scotland, but it sounds like a huge amount of work went into a feasibility study, and we didn't even get to the pilot stage. So that's disappointing, because I think, as you said, these stories, but also any of the data and the information we get from trials on kind of progressive and challenging the status quo are really important. I'm going to bring in a couple of our comments, because we've got loads. There's a comment here: if a country has a decent social safety net in place, it's okay to push for a universal basic income. In the US, so thanks so much for watching Scotonomics from the States. We appreciate that. In the US, we have no such social safety net. We don't even have healthcare. It's a folly for us to concentrate on a UBI. We need universal basic services. So thanks very much for that comment. We'll definitely cover some alternatives to UBI, but also some kind of complementary policies as well. So we've got Mark's still watching us, so he agreed with your analysis, and he said the key is for the Welsh Government to share their final research when it's over, so everyone learns. We've also got this, which I think is a really interesting comment. I'd like you to comment on this, Jamie. UBI is going to be a necessary step to combat the rising of AI technologies and the automation of the working sectors. I think that's enough for you to be going with. Let's start with this one first. Basic income, and we'll try and keep this short because we've still got a few more to get to. Basic income. How would it help us combat this perceived challenge of automation and AI?
So I think it's been a really interesting one, because in Scotland, the drive around basic income has been from primarily, I think, a sense of social justice. So how do we create a fairer society? How do we create a social security system that's fit for the 21st century? Excuse me. In the US, for example, the growing interest in basic income has been driven a lot more from that sense of AI and the changing nature of work there. And it's led to some challenging areas, because, there's an awful lot of the kind of tech entrepreneurs are very big basic income fans. And whenever you hear, Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg has used the term, you think, I'm going to have to, quickly go out and explain that they're talking about something completely and utterly different. And usually based on their own fear that people are going to show up at the gate with pitchforks because they've taken their jobs away. I think a basic income allows people, you would hope, with that security to have a bit more degree of choice and flexibility around work. I think it gives us a chance to also look at, for me, one of the challenges we face is when we look at funding a basic income, we very much look at it within, the kind of how we funded things in the past, rather than looking at some of these new strands that are coming out. So what's data as a potential revenue stream? How do we start to look at the commons and other areas of potential resources there? So I think that AI is definitely a challenge and something that a basic income can provide that flexibility. We saw during the pandemic, where it wasn't AI that suddenly stopped people working, but there was that huge impact of an external force, that it had that been in place, it would have given people a quicker response that could be tailored in terms of the situation they encounter. So I think AI is a challenge. I think what I would say from Scotland's perspective, in my experience, is that not enough of the debate here is about that changing nature of work. We kind of treat it as if it's separate, whereas actually that changing nature of work is an issue of social justice. So actually, when we see that, the amount of impact that some of these new technologies will have across the economy, then actually people will be impacted by that. And we need to be looking at those new ways of providing security for them.
Okay. Karen, do you want to jump in there with thoughts on, do we need people doing stuff?
Yeah, I want to comment on this concern about UBI and jobs. What we see currently at the moment is we have a real problem with enough people to care for other people. So, for example, in the medical sector, you're going to see UBI hopefully taking away some of the actually slightly more boring jobs, and hopefully give the medics more time to actually spend with their patients, maybe touch them. Maybe make them feel, slightly loved and cared for, which often they don't have time to do for at the moment. I think that applies to a lot of other things. I think it's also, I'm going to say this controversial, I think it's a very masculine point of view, and we've discussed this with economics in general as being a very masculine, science. Not that I would really term it as science, but this idea that work has to be at certain things, when we know that, for example, care work is so important. Do we want our elderly people to not have someone to spend time with them? I was listening to Age Concern over the holidays, and there was a guy there that worked for Age Concern, and he'd spent his morning on Christmas Day phoning elderly people who are on their own. So there's a lot of work to be done that a lot of people don't seem to think is work. And also, I think that the possibility of artificial intelligence freeing us up to do more things that are actually much more deeply important for each other I think is hopeful. There is something I want to ask you as well on the technical gubbins again, the universal basic income. So you talked about the Manitoba experiment. And the Manitoba experiment was a topping up. It wasn't a universal basic income. The other concern that I have is, of course, that if you give a universal basic income to everyone, then people who have lots of spare currency in their bank accounts, they'll just stash it in an offshore bank account. So again, coming back to the mechanics of how it will work, how do you see dealing with that particular problem?
Yeah, no, good point. And I just want to say, I mean, I fully agree with you around the approach to how we value work. And it's an absolute crime that care, which is such an essential part and the last thing anyone wants undervalued, is yet probably the most undervalued part of our economy. It's a disgrace, and I think anything we can do to address that has to be critical. I mean, in terms of that sense of giving to those who already have, I think there's a couple of aspects to that. One is that there's with the interactions with the taxation system, then you would be taking back from people who have the higher earners from that basic income. So I think financially, most of them would not be in the positive with that. And actually, depending on how you use the tax system, might actually be losing slightly on it. However, I think there's a couple of things. One is there's a simplicity then of delivering to everybody rather than getting into means testing and finding where that different layer is. If you're taking it back through taxation rather than when you're giving it out to people, that can have a positive impact. I think there's a sense around the sense of when we've seen policies that are universal as opposed to those that are targeted. When it comes to elections, it's far easier to go after those that are targeted. So whilst we can see the NHS is under constant attack just now, it's lasted a bit longer than perhaps some of our more targeted benefits have, because politically it's a lot easier to impact them. I had actually hoped, one of the impacts of the pandemic was that people suddenly coming into experience with universal credit, who had never had to before, would realise what an absolute inhumane failure of a system it is, because suddenly the rubbish we've been fed deliberately through the media and political sources around it being some sort of luxurious benefit was shown to be absolute nonsense. I think as well, there's something around the kind of changing nature of that economy and work and where we are, that some of the insecurity probably spreads an awful lot further up the food chain than it used to as well. So if you have that resource that allows people to question some of their own decisions or to give some more security, even though perhaps on paper they have more finances to start with, I think that to me is a benefit as well. But it's that interaction with the tax system and how you can bring it back. We've had other novel suggestions. So people have talked about, could you donate your basic income? If you felt you financially didn't need it, it could go into a pot for something else. Is there a way you could use it? I think, again, going back to what we said about rent control and everything else, this needs to be designed in a way to ensure that that is not just a case of those who already have more than enough piling this up and claiming interest on it. So I think it's a very good caution to raise around the policy.
Great. Okay. Fantastic. Still a few to go through. I think this is a confirmation. And sorry, Gregor, I probably should have said this at the start. Gregor said, what would happen to benefits in social security if there's a universal basic income? I know you spoke at the start about what would happen for disability payments, for example, but what would happen to all the other benefits in the social security system if we introduced a UBI?
So there are variations upon this according to politics and where you are. Generally speaking, most of the kind of models suggest that most of the existing social security system would be rolled into this, and then you're given the opportunity to use with that what you see fit. I think there's a couple of things. As we said, housing currently is a thorny issue for us to resolve. Definitely disability is an individual issue, but also we had the comment from our watcher from the US talking about basic services. Again, to me, this is about social security. It's not about services. And there absolutely, to me, should be policies that are complementary and supporting each other. I think we strengthen our services by having a foundation underneath them. I think for me, a basic income is that restoring of the concept of a social contract that allows others to flourish. So I think, this is not about, and there are, right-wing libertarian versions of a basic income that are proposed, that actually you could scrap the NHS and you would give people a really generous basic income, but you wouldn't spend anything else. That's certainly not the model I'm proposing. This is within the system of public services that we have that should be strengthened and supported, that I think would have a longer term investment benefit for them, but is not about replacing the NHS, education or other areas around that. It's about those social security aspects. There's some of the ways you can look at it is how it feeds into things like, the tax allowance and areas around that as well. But as I say, housing, individual benefits would be retained. Things around, child benefit and so on would be rolled in.
Fantastic. Okay, I have a question for you, a direct one. All things being equal, ceteris paribus, as we say in the world of economics, all things being equal, is it better to have a job with an income or to have an income?
I think the idea of an income with no purpose in your life, I think, is horrendous and is not beneficial. I think it's moving away from the concept of the income solely being attached to paid labor into what we are able to do with it. So I want to see an income that is attached to quality ways of spending your life. I think having an income with a job that is soul destroying and pointless is incredibly detrimental to people. I think having an income that gives you the ability to have use your time and your work rather than your paid labor in different ways, I think is essential and allows us to start to fully cherish some of that impact around caring, responsibilities and others that we currently treat as unpaid and unimportant labor.
Right. And there was a job guarantee, a big job guarantee trial. Well, it was actually ran for a few years in Argentina, and it was stopped a couple of years ago or a few years ago. And one of the research questions was, what has been the most meaningful part of this job guarantee? And people said being able to contribute and make a meaningful impact. More people said that than they said the income. And I found that really, really interesting. And also another study, which was, I think it was from some basic income studies in India. The idea was that you would give people a basic income and they would set up their own business, and it would kind of release this hidden desire, this entrepreneur, which is in everyone, according to certain economists and certain political parties, that you gave them some income and they would all become these entrepreneurs who would start all these new businesses. And what actually happened was that these people would use this income to allow them to get a better full-time paid job. And this idea that we were all these entrepreneurs was just shown to be completely false. And again, I thought that was really interesting, that you might find that the desire that people get from this income is to find a secure job rather than do something that they consider a kind of meaningful, self-employed role. What's your thoughts on those couple of bits of kind of empirical study?
Absolutely. I think, I've always been struck. Dan Pink in his book, Drive, talks about, people want purpose, autonomy, mastery. So, you need to pay people enough that they're not spending all their time worrying about whether they have enough. And then it's about giving that purpose. So I think those studies find that people really benefited from having a contribution. And there's, variations of basic income that maybe tone down the unconditionality slightly by focusing more on that kind of contributory aspect. But I think if you give people that security, then they are empowered to also do more with it and have that. And people want purpose. They want impact. We have a system just now that does the exact opposite. There's a reason we're having to force people through sanctions into these jobs that people don't find empowering or supportive for them. I think as well, though, it's about that sense of how do we recognize, touching on what we did a minute ago, how do we recognize those different ways that people can spend their lives? What do you provide to support them? So if you suddenly give everybody money tomorrow and we've not provided new resources, so you're going to become an entrepreneur, but actually you live in a community that traditionally hasn't had formal entrepreneurs. And so there's not a nice, set up for you to go access, training or support or access. And it's the people who know people who still can make use of it. It's recognizing that wider societal change and support that needs us around this. So, we always talked about for any experiment or pilot, you should do at least a kind of year's run up before you start it, because suddenly giving people money tomorrow, if you've not prepared them and given them support for that, if you don't give them that wider system for them, I think that puts them in a very unfair position. But yeah, purpose, I think, and impact is the critical part of this.
Great. Kieran, any final questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, touching on what we're talking about, that sense of purpose, that I am an advocate for a job guarantee, and I helped write a paper on that for Modern Money Scotland. But, David Graeber writes in his book, Bullshit Jobs, that there's so many people employed in jobs that they don't find fulfilling. And I think the state has something to contribute towards ensuring that is the case. Absolutely. Yeah, I lived in the Netherlands for 5 years, and I saw a system of progressive social security, for example, where people who become unemployed are given 90% of their income for a certain amount of time, and that's reduced over a length of time. So, for example, if you have car payments, etc., you have time to adjust to a lower income if you think you won't get a job that's not going to pay as much as that. So I think with universal basic income, I think a lot of the sentiment is right, coming from people who are advocates for this. I don't think it's the way forward. I think an adjustment of making social security humane and dignified is the right way to go. I think your example from Manitoba, when you're talking about how the women then chose to take time with their children as opposed to money, is an example of that. But of course, in some westernized democracies, we have, and we do have that here. You give people time to spend with their children when they've just been born. Of course, you should do that. That's logical. So I think there's an awful lot of crossover between, the sentiment of what a job guarantee offers and what universal basic income offers. I would say on a macroeconomic level, I think job guarantee is a better idea. But yeah, I think the sentiments and the desire for a more socially inclusive society is within both thinking,
Yeah. And I think I agree 100%. And I think one of the things that was a shame for a while, but feels like it's maybe changing a bit, is that everyone was kind of set up as competing views. And that doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree or that all are deliverable, but I think actually recognizing, agree with you 100% about a more humane system, about finding that opportunity and purpose, even if we may disagree about some of the ways of delivering that. But for me, ultimately, I started by saying that I hadn't come into this in the beginning as someone who was a passionate, instant believer in basic income. And for me, fundamentally, it still remains that if basic income is not the answer, or if it's a part of a basic income, or, it certainly isn't the only answer, if, in my view, it's part of it, it's certainly asking some of the questions we need to be asking. And I think the more we can do those and move to actually changing things, then the better for all of us, whatever direction that takes us in.
Well, before we finish, Jamie, I'd like to cover the kind of macroeconomic impact of a UBI. And as you said at the start, it's impossible to even approach testing this impact when we're only having these really small pilots. But let's say we give everyone a universal basic income of let's say £1,000 a month. Any idea on what the macroeconomic impact of that payment right across society would be? And is there any kind of evidence or theories on what that impact would be?
Well, I'll hold my hands up. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to claim full knowledge there. I think that the evidence has been, with the basic income, you're looking at recycling money that's in the system. So therefore, the hope is that the inflationary impact is going to be smaller than creating something new from within that. Although I know there'll be other ways to deliver that, or to look at that moving forward. I think what we've seen where these cash payments have been introduced in various forms is that a lot of time the money is reinvested in, as I say, education. So people taking time out to educate, or in cutting down their own debt impacts. We've seen that, whether it's the kind of annual one-off payment that the Alaskan fund makes there. The majority of that's used for putting towards the university fees for young people in the US within Alaska, or for paying off, home improvements debt that's attached there. And also that spend on, undesirable goods. And that, it's always ironic in Scotland if we suggest not spending on alcohol, considering the contribution to the economy. But, that actually it's found that generally there's not an impact there in terms of increased spending on alcohol and others. So I think for me, it needs more work. I think there's certainly not been enough work for me about the longer term potential impacts, that we touched on in terms of health benefits, impact on wider economy. I know that when we'd had initial discussions with some of the local authorities in Scotland who were not part of the feasibility group, there had been discussions around, should a basic income be attached to like a local currency, so that you weren't just seeing money shipped off to Amazon as soon as it came into people's pockets. So I think, as I say, without having the in-depth knowledge myself, I think there's definitely work to be done there. But I think the aspect of giving people that regular, the fact they know it's there, it's not a one-off payment that you have to make an instant decision upon. You can build on that security on a regular basis, I think would have those benefit impacts.
Right. I think we're talking around about, if it was 50 million across the UK and it's 1,000 a month, I think that's 5 billion a month. Now that seems like a huge amount of money that would be injected into the economy. But actually, most months last year, we were providing more in interest payments on government bonds than 5 billion. So it's almost like saying, we quite easily can cope with 5 billion of new currency injected into the economy if effectively we're creating that, and the central bank is effectively paying that to people who own bonds. So it does seem like a huge amount of money. I would imagine that would be able to cope with that. Now, the other question, again, you're not an economist, but we're going to cover this. Where would that 50 billion or that 5 billion, come from? How would we afford a basic universal income, Jamie? Not at the Scottish level, at the UK level.
UK level. Well, I mean, we've published a couple of reports over the last few years. One, 2019, a basic income for Scotland at the RSA that covered our model for introducing a basic income in Scotland. And it was at a much lower level than the £1,000 a month. It effectively matched the current universal credit system and said, what would you do if you took away the conditionality and the sanctions and the impacts there, and the modelling that was attached to that suggested significant impacts around poverty reduction and particularly around destitution, even at quite a low level to respond to. I think there's a few things to that. So one is that there will be savings, obviously, because you're going to use some of the existing social security system to be rolled into this. So there's obviously, this isn't all additional money on top. It's utilising some of what's already there. I think there's also that impact around, certainly one of the models we had proposed when you compared it to cuts that had been made in recent years to kind of business taxes from a UK-wide level. They actually were not far off each other in terms of what the cost could have contributed there. So you're looking at these other forms of the system. But again, going back, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this from your own experiences. It feels like there's a very instinctive thing to say, let's look at income tax. So how do we raise income tax to pay for this? And income tax obviously has a role to play within it. But what are the systems for the 21st century that we've not been looking at? So this has been attached to conversations around land value tax and other areas around that. It's looking at data as a resource that currently mostly flows into private pockets, even though it's a social good. Guy Stanning's talked about the commons and actually that sense of how much of the money in society is built on resources that are part of the commons, but actually have been privatized or commercialized, and people have not paid their due on top of that. So I think the critical bit is not just looking at it from my perspective as can we pay this under the current system, but how can we start to look at a system in future that would allow us to have those choices. But as you say, what we have seen, the pandemic was a real push for this. And there was that moment during the pandemic where, we were going to build back better and everything was really optimistic. And suddenly we could pay for stuff. Money was there and it was able to be utilized. So, that raises very interesting questions around why we can't do that on a day-to-day basis. I'm sure Karen could talk about it far better than me.
Yeah, well, on a very, very simplistic level, the government is the currency issuer of the currency we all use. And so it's never going to run out of money. It can always create money. And we always especially see this when the talk of war comes to the head and everyone says, oh, you didn't have money for something else, but you always have money for this. And yeah, that seems to be always the case. So yeah, it's not a matter of finding the money for that. The UK government always can create the money if it wants to politically do something. But you're right. What are the macroeconomic consequences of that? So obviously, if you give a lot of people a lot of money in one go, they might all start going out and buying the same things, and then that creates an inflationary bubble. So you've got to think about that as a government, and what your currency, where it's going, and the effects it's going to have. The one that concerns both me and William is that, for example, when you're paying money on bonds every month, that money's just going into a bank account and not really doing anything. And it's not really performing a good function within our society. So, it's not a matter of they have to find the money. They can always produce the money to do it. And the UK government doesn't rely on taxation for money. it creates the money in the first place. So just want to make that perfectly clear to everyone if they don't know this already after watching the show.
Yeah, but I think, Jamie, it's really, because we off air we were speaking a lot about MMT, but I think this is really, really important to kind of get across to you, to someone who's clearly in this space. If we go back to that figure of £5 billion, that £5 billion, if that was a universal basic income, that money doesn't have to be found. There's no need to find that money. The government, with all government spending, creates the currency. It creates new currency and it spends it into the economy. Now, it can create 5 billion, 50 billion, 500 billion. This is how all government spending takes place. So this idea, and I deliberately asked you that question to get to here, but this idea that we've got to find the money from other places, so we're not spending it on this, therefore we have an amount of money that we can spend, or we have to tax this to get that amount of money to spend. That's just not how the monetary system works. Now, the governments account for that spending from taxation and from selling bonds, but that money isn't needed to be spent. We just create the currency and we spend it. And importantly is that it's an economic opinion that you need to tax and sell bonds to level this amount of money that you're spending. That's not an economic fact. It's only an opinion. It just happens to be an opinion that's shared by the people who are in positions of power at the moment. But heterodox economists don't believe that it can be accounted for in different ways. But even if there's a difference in that opinion, very, very few people don't agree that governments create new currency when they spend. Christine Lagarde this week, who's head of the European Central Bank, has said exactly that there's always the ability to create this currency. So I think it's really important that, when you're having these conversations, it's about the will to create a universal basic income. It's never about the funding. At the UK level, we can always afford the funding. It's never an issue with finding that money. It's the will to spend that money that's the problem. Yeah. Yes.
No, absolutely. I mean, there is no doubting that the lack of will is covered by all manner of sins and explanations that, as you say, are given as the orthodoxy then that you can't challenge. I think for me, there is still the interesting question around how we approach our funding of the economy. Yes, there's, talking about the ability to create money there, but moving away from that description just being about income tax or just being about one way we've done things previously, I think it's fantastic that we're having a wider discussion around how we approach the economy, money, functioning of society. And I think for me, therefore, if it does allow us to look at some of these other revenues and other resources that are currently not going into the public good. So if tax bond money is sitting in a bank making money for someone else that's of no social purpose, likewise, what's happening with the use of the commons, the use of data and other areas. Taxation is not the only way to make use of that in a socially progressive way, but I think it is part of how we think about, are we getting benefit of these resources as well? And at the end of the day, a basic income is something that gives you an individual choice over how you spend that money, but also comes to you because you're part of something bigger. You're part of that societal and that commons behind it.
Jamie, lovely way to finish. Thank you so much for joining us. It was worth the wait. It was absolutely worth the wait. We had loads of comments and questions, so thanks very much to everyone who engaged with the show tonight. And Jamie, thanks so much. Best of luck with your new endeavours, and I'm sure we'll see you in this policy space later. And we would love you to come to our Festival of Economics in March. So I'll drop you an invite to that. Jamie, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you both. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Wonderful interview from Jamie there, and covered a lot of our thoughts and also lots of the questions from our audience. So thanks very much for that. Next week, we have another live interview, a wonderful interview with Nancy Fraser, who is an American economist. She's a heterodox economist, a Marxist feminist, economist. So we're looking at her views, which are contained in her wonderful book, which was one of our 5 books of the year, which is called Cannibal Capitalism. So that's a live interview with Nancy, who's joining us from the States. So please do join live, and hopefully we'll have as many questions and as many answers for you next week. Until then, thanks so much for joining us. Bye from me.
Bye-bye.